London's trashy, trendy Soho with its bars and boutiques is not the first place that comes to mind when you think of Karl Marx. But he'd be very at home here. He was at home here. He lived in this building in the 1850s. And London became the communist capital of the world at the time. And I'm off to meet a man who not only thinks Marx is much maligned, but is still relevant today.
That's quite hard to do for 21st century society, when the man was writing here, exiled from Paris in the 1850s. But my guest wants to drag him from museum relic to modern relevance, via the pub.
So come on, Owen, why do you like Marx so much?
To be honest, Giles, I can hardly avoid him growing up. I've got, I don't know, 4 generations of family who were involved in some sort of radical politics. More than a few copies of Karl Marx's books are lying around when I was growing up.
Well, actually, that's quite apt, because we're sat in the Museum Tavern, opposite the British Museum in London, and that's where he wrote Das Kapital, but he's often more comfortable sat in the pub.
He certainly liked his drink, Marx. He's not the dour old crusty philosopher I think a lot of people think of him as. He went on these infamous pub crawls. He's once reputed to have smashed a mirror in this very pub with a bar stool, for example. He was chased by police officers because of his drunken antics. Of course, it's not that makes him so interested in Marx. It's his ideas, and I think actually a lot of them are still relevant today. I'll give you one example: alienation. It's this idea that by working for someone else, you lose control over your own life, your own destiny, if you like. You lose a bit of your own humanity. I think today, whether you work in a call centre or an office, you could certainly drink to that. As Karl Marx himself would say, Prost.
Prost.
Dr Elizabeth Fraser, Fellow in Politics at New College, Oxford, our in-house expert, says, like him or loathe him, Marx is a huge figure.
If you want an idea of how big Marx is, then he's the one who's got an ism with his name in front of it. He's the only person for whom you can be a Marxist.
But criticism of Marx is extensive, from the academic and economic to the enraged and impassioned.
Marx is criticised for exactly the reason that his admirers admire him. According to him, it's production that explains everything else, and many of his critics say that's just plain wrong. There's another issue, which is that he thought about the role of the Communist Party in a way that, with hindsight, we can see enabled Lenin to develop his idea of the Vanguard Party, and that opened up the authoritarian state party systems of the Soviet era.
That's clearly something to put to a fan, but not before I've shown him something at the Marx Memorial Library.
So there you are, Owen. Communist Manifesto. 4 decades after it was first published, but still, that's the 1888 edition.
Which is extraordinary, because that's only 5 years after Marx died, and Engels himself was still alive. And don't forget, this is the 2nd most read book on earth after the Bible itself.
But isn't that the problem? The Communist Manifesto, this connection to Marx, it means of all thinkers, he's the one that gets the charge, you're responsible for the death of millions of people.
But blaming Marx for the Stalinist totalitarian regimes which killed millions of people, it's a bit like blaming Jesus for the Crusades. There's absolutely nothing in his work whatsoever which backs the gulags, the Stalinist police states.
But there is lots in there about revolution.
Absolutely, but don't forget, Marx was writing at a time of despots and autocrats that dominated the European continent. Even in Britain, there still wasn't universal suffrage even for men. Now, what Marx actually later argued was that if you had universal suffrage for men, you could have a democratic, peaceful transition to socialism, because it would allow a majority of working people to be elected to Parliament.
So here we are, Highgate Cemetery. Anyone who's seen it, Marx's grave, I think it's a fairly big monument.
That's the funny thing. Originally, it was only a very small rock. Marx was a modest man. Only a very few people actually even turned up to his funeral. It was only in the 1950s that this huge, extravagant monument we know today was actually put up.
So there he is. What relevance does Marx have to our politics today, do you think? I mean, isn't it all a bit over?
You'd have to be an armed revolutionary or even on the left to think this was a pretty prescient bloke. He predicted globalisation. He wrote of the need for capitalists to constantly go across the globe looking for ever-expanding markets. He wrote how capitalism lurched constantly from crisis to crisis. And he also predicted that capitalism would create a huge working class. And if you look on a global scale, that's exactly what has happened. And if you want to understand the world, if you're interested in social justice, you can't ignore Karl Marx.